Hello, my elegant warriors. Welcome back to How to Advocate, the newest season of the podcast. And today I have a friend, but also someone that I look up to, and her wisdom when it comes to her topic is beyond compare. Her name is Ann Lester. She spent 20 years as the head of retirement solutions at JP Morgan. It doesn't get much more expert than that when it comes to retirement solutions. She is with AARP. She co-founded the Aspen Leadership Forum on retirement savings, and now she has written a book called Your Best Financial Life: Save Smart Now for the Future You Want, which comes out March 12th. And welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Heather. I'm really pleased to be here.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you. I have to admit, well, there's so many things I want to talk about, but I have to admit that this is an area that I feel vulnerable about. I feel a little bit of shame about the things that I don't know. I struggle talking to my financial advisor sometimes. And so reading this book was really helpful. I can't tell you how much I appreciated the way that you opened the book, talking
Oh,
about Japan. So I'm not going to ask you to tell a lot of stories because I want everyone to read the book, but just tell us a little bit about that because it made me feel so much better.
oh, well, thank you for saying that, Heather. And let me just say one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is exactly what you just shared. I think a lot of people are carrying around a lot of shame and self-blame for their finances, and there's just too much self-censoring and fear going on. And you said something really powerful, which is that you actually don't like telling things to your financial advisor. It's like, seeing a therapist and then not wanting to talk about your problems. Like they're there to help you, but yet we are so caught up in these stories that we tell ourselves about how we're not doing it right, that it blocks us from seeking help. So that opening for the book, it's funny, I hadn't even thought about that until I was like working on the book and I was trying to figure out some story that would kind of put me in that moment, and bang, there it was. I had just finished up a year-long internship in Tokyo and had been making some reasonably decent money over the summer, but I'd been on a Fulbright scholarship, which is, like not super remunerative, and had had a very low-paying job before that working in politics and for a senator. And so I didn't have any money and I was moving to Milan. And I got to the airport and I had two huge carry-ons and one huge carry-on and two huge suitcases. And when I'd gone to Japan, I'd had the same amount of luggage and the airlines just took my luggage. But leaving Japan, I was flying on KLM. And I did not know that US carriers at the time, it was a rule that if you were flying in or out of the US, you could take two check bags. And if you're internationally flying, you could take one check bag. And I'd never heard of luggage weights. And so I went to the counter and they weighed my luggage and they said, "You're wildly overweight. You can only have one piece of check luggage that's too big to take as a carry-on." And I was going to have to pay something like $400 in overweight fees. And I knew my credit card was maxed out. And I gave him my credit card anyway, and it didn't work. And I found myself in tears with this huge line of people behind me, just thinking, what a colossal failure I am because I can't even get my bags on an airplane to move. I mean, it was a real low point in my financial life, and I, it was just devastating. And the guy eventually just like waved me on and waived all the fees and let me go. But it was a horrible, horrible moment.
I think that reading that and it was so empathetic for you to start the book that way because I have read other financial books. I work hard to have a good relationship with my money because it doesn't come naturally to me. And I don't even like to say that because I'm trying to get out of that frame of mind. But when I read that, my shoulders kind of dropped and I was like, oh, she gets me. She's not
Mhm.
like this, guru on the top of a mountain that I have to climb up to try to meet and understand. And consistently throughout the book, you do that. You have this beautiful acronym STASH that you sort of go through on the things that you can be doing, could be doing with your money, and the ways that you could be doing it. And it's never prescriptive. It's always sort of conversational. I love the book. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Oh, thank
And
you.
I will also say, It seems, correct me if I'm wrong, the book is directed towards those who are sort of under 45, people who
Mhm.
are at the earlier stages of their career and to encourage them to save. Is that
Yep,
fair?
absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. And so I'm not in that age bracket. And yet there are a lot of things that I felt like I could use for myself. So I want to talk about all of that. But first, I want to talk about this thing with women and money. And it's a little bit led to me by, I just finished the book, The Women by Kristen Hanna, which is a
Mhm.
fiction book about women in nurses in the Vietnam War. And that book, and I don't want any spoilers for anyone, but it really made me see in a way that I hadn't seen for a while how little financial freedom women had not that long ago. And in fact, in preparation for something else, I Googled it. And when I was born in 72, women were not by law allowed to open their own credit cards, have their own mortgages, or have their own bank accounts. And so I think that it makes sense that a lot of us don't know these things or feel shame around these things. And in the work that you've done over all of those years, do you see that to be true for women? And do you think that that's part of the reason why?
I think I did some focus groups, and one of the things that was interesting is the surveys that I did. I surveyed about 1,000 people between the ages of 21 and 45, and about how well they were doing. And this was self-reported, and I'm always slightly skeptical about that from a data perspective, but let's just take it all as given that it was all accurate. So self-reported how they were doing based on how much they'd saved and how much they had invested, and how much debt they had, and also how they felt about how well they were doing. And one of the things that was fascinating was that um, the group that did well and knew it skewed very heavily male.
Yeah.
The group that was doing well and did not know it skewed female. The group that thought they were doing well, but was not, skewed male.
Yeah.
And then the group that did not do well and knew it was kind of 50-50. So just there you go, right? There's just like there's a confidence thing or an assumption that I'm doing it right that seems to skew male, and uncertainty seems to skew female. Um, why that is, I mean, certainly I think we can't discount for women our age, and I'm just going to say I'm 8 years older than you are. But we grew up, we were born into a world where certainly our mothers and our female elders, right, did not know, were not enabled, were not taught because, like as you pointed out, they couldn't. And to overcome that was a special person. My grandmother, when my grandfather passed away, my grandmother took over the money, and she had been in charge of making financial decisions. They would have had a ton more money at the end of their lives than they did with my grandfather in charge. But oh well. So it's not that they couldn't, but they weren't empowered to, they weren't taught. So I think that's a thing. But today, one of the things that I found most disheartening about the data was that the Gen Z women, so women under, when I did the survey, sort of 25, 21 to 25, were already saving less money than the men were their age. They were already, relatively speaking, further behind. And I didn't have the ability to go and probe that more deeply, but just anecdotally, I do think women tend to orient towards lower paying jobs, whether as industries, service industries, teaching, hospitality, right? Those just pay less well. And then there's the famous 80% wage gap, right? I hope that's not really hitting those entry level workers. It might be, but just out of the gate, we're not as well equipped. And then there is this incredibly toxic in a girl math thing, right? Like, oh, tee hee hee, this is too complicated for me. I still remember one of my friends who's got daughters, um, just just flames shooting out of her eyes when she saw this. I think it was a Barbie ad, actually, weirdly. This is like 10 years ago, saying, something like, math is hard, but shopping is fun, right? And it's just like, this messaging, right? I don't think that's happening anymore. I think we've kind of stomped that out, but I do think that there's this societal tendency, right, to belittle women's abilities to control impulses, to make financial decisions, to be numerate even.
Mm.
And yet, the statistics show that, for instance, female money managers, of which I was one, routinely outperform men because we have a much better ability to take risk.
Yeah.
And you can just go back to that overconfidence thing I pointed to. Men are overconfident and women are not, and we are better risk takers than men. So it is a persistent icky thing.
This is your next book, Anne, in case you didn't know.
I've got too many next books going on right now, but thank you.
I'm sure. And we want to stick with this one. But I think it's fascinating. That's one of the things my financial advisor consistently says to me. You're doing so much better than you think you are. You know so much more than you think you do. And that is a great thought, a great belief to have. And so I think for those listening, hear Anne about her statistics in that survey. And I love that survey. You talk about that survey, the 2021 surveys that you did. And there's a lot of great information and data that you got out of that. But I think that to know that we're doing better than we think we are, we're better at it than we think we are, and that to have a growth mindset around money. And that in turn will lead us to read books like yours without feeling like, I don't know what this Roth IRA thing is. And I don't understand what you mean by the 401k and matching, and sort of just like start playing cartoons in our head. And so I think that it's really it's really important to let that shame go. It's you tell a story, and I'm not going to ask you to tell it because I want the readers to be drawn to the stories. But you tell the story about the puzzle when you were a little
Mm.
girl, and it's this whole thing about, like, shame and blame, and that all seems to come around money, and that we sort of have to let go so that we can get curious and let it be playful and let it be a little bit of fun, which is the way that I think men have been trained to look at it. And I don't want to sort of create this divide there. I also did think it was funny with your survey, though, that if I remember correctly, one third of couples don't know what the other person in the couple makes. What do you make of that?
That's not my work. That was somebody else's survey, but people don't like talking about money. I think there's another statistic, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but something like, I think it's something like 70 or 80% of parents would rather talk to their kids about sex than money. I mean, just think about like the top taboo subjects in our lives, and money is right up there. There is a lot of money. Um, I think the term for it that financial coaches use is money infidelity, right? Hiding purchases from your spouse or being ashamed to own up to what you're doing. I confess, my husband and I have joint everythings, but we're legally on the accounts, but we have our separate accounts and we do what we want. And occasionally I have bought things and got, I wonder if Adrian's going to notice that I just bought that, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I wasn't hiding it, but I certainly wasn't volunteering and saying, hey, honey, I just spent X on this, right? Like,
right.
so it's I often draw analogies to food as well. Like it's just something that it all comes back to impulse control, and this notion of somebody wagging their fingers somewhere saying you should be doing a better job. And one of the key elements of the book for me, and this is what unlocked it all for me, is understanding how we're wired, both sort of genetically, the nature side of it and the nurture side of it. They're both important and they intersect in us in different ways in everybody, but once you understand how you're wired, it becomes a lot easier to just accept it. Like we're all born with a genetic predisposition for height,
Yes.
right? You can't, I mean, maybe some people do, but like you can dislike how tall you are, whether it's too tall or too short, but like it is what it is, right? And to some extent, the
Mhm.
way we're wired around money is what it is. And you can, once you understand your wiring and the stories that formed the experiences that formed the way you react to your own wiring, you can start doing things about it. It's not impossible to change, but you're probably not going to fundamentally rewire the way your brain is predisposed to respond to something. So I'm a spender. Like I love to spend money. I'm happy when I spend money. I actually enjoy going to the grocery store because I get to shop. Like that's okay, that's kind of sad, but that's just who I
I'm
am.
like that too.
Um, like it's fun.
Yeah.
Ding, I just spent money. Uh, and I know that about myself now. So I literally won't let myself go into stores unless I have a list and I know what I'm buying. And I have stopped trying clothes on unless I know I need them, because if they fit and they look good, I'm going to buy them. Like I just will. So I know that about myself, and I am much better about managing my environment so I don't spend.
I love that. When you know yourself and you're willing to observe yourself,
Yeah.
oh, this is what I do in this setting, then you can become your own best authority. I always say, like for your book, you are the expert, Anne. I'm the authority on Heather Hansen, but I have to know myself and observe myself enough to say, oh, you do this thing and apply your expertise to me. And I love one of the ways that you allow the reader to do that is you have one of those quizzes. Everybody loves the quiz, and sort of to figure out what kind of a spender or saver are you, which allows you to observe yourself. And those, I think that's one of the value of quizzes is that in you're sort of retrospectively observing the
Yeah.
things that you do, and that can sort of get you in the habit of doing that. Um, and I love that you talk about the genetics of it, which I thought was fascinating. And you set up, we talked about this stash and ways to do each of these, which I do want to talk through
Mhm.
relatively, just touch upon each one of them, but how to make some of this automatic. So, and to continue the analogy of food, so don't buy the food because then it's not in the house and then you can't eat it. So, talk to me about making things automatic. And then I want to just sort of talk through the stash framework.
Yeah. So this is certainly nothing I developed. It's been out there. People have won Nobel Prizes for it, right? This whole idea of using your own inertia to help and not hurt you. So you actually cause yourself pain when you deny yourself something you want right now. So saving, which is denying yourself money that you could spend on yourself right now for the future, is painful. And every time you ask yourself to make that decision, you're putting a big load on your brain, like you're making it do hard things. So the best way to save is to not create the circumstances where you're making the choice. You automate it. That's one of the reasons why if you have a workplace savings program like a 401k, sometimes they're called 403bs and they have like other vegetable and number and letter soup names. But um, if you've got that automated saving into your 401k, let's say, it's painless because you don't ever notice the money leaving. It just is gone.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to get out. It's possible, but not a great idea. So it's very sticky too. It's you want no friction as the money leaves your account, and you want there to be friction to get to it, right? So if you're saving for an emergency savings fund, having a separate high yield savings account where you have the money automatically go is so powerful because your brain doesn't have to work. So automating is key.
Without a doubt, and it's key sort of on every step of your framework.
Yeah.
So the stash framework, why don't you just talk us through
Mhm.
that?
So stash, and you can think about it as building your stash for retirement, right, is 5 steps, right? The first is saving for a rainy day, and that's an emergency savings fund. The second is tax aware savings and investing, and that would be your 401k or IRA. The third step, the A, is to assess your budget and start paying down high interest rate debt first, and then work on the rest of your debt. The fourth step, the S of stash again is to continue to maximize to stay the course and maximize your tax aware savings until you're saving for most people around 15% of your gross income. That's a scary number, but we'll talk about how to get there. And then the last part, H, is to have some fun and save for the fun stuff, vacations, weddings, trips, housing, right? There are all kinds of things we want to save our money for that are not, retirement or paying down debt.
Yeah, there's so much in there. So, and I'm going to come back to this point in a minute, but I have been a full-time employee since I was in law school at the same place.
Mm.
So, and now this year, I am now a full-time employee of myself. And so there's a lot of things that I'm doing, and I'll come back to this, but this book was so helpful for me. Like when people say don't have a high interest thing, whether it's a loan or a credit card, what is high interest? And so you talk us through that in a way that is so understandable and so relatable. And I have a list of things now that I want to do and look at in my life and in my portfolio. But I want to get back to, I think that saving for a rainy day and the tax advantage savings, the ST, um, are really are really important that the listeners read and digest and apply to themselves without shame, but with pure curiosity. But I do want to talk about this idea of saving 15%, putting 15% towards retirement, because I know that a lot of the listeners are like, is this lady high?
It feels impossible. Listen, I was going to say it's impossible. It's not impossible. It's impossible to do at once. And when I throw out the 15% number, if you work for an employer who has a 401k, and if they do something called matching, which means that they're contribute for every dollar you put in, they will put in something. And there are all kinds of formulas. Some employers will put in 25%, so they'll put in 25 cents for a dollar, up to 10%, right? Some will match 100% of what you put in up to 5%. So the formulas all depend on the employer, but almost every employer who has a 401k matches. So when I say 15%, that's 15% total. So if
Mm-hmm.
your employer is matching, it may not be quite that much of your own money.
Right.
If you have started saving for retirement in your 20s at your first job and you are saving 10% of your own money and getting a match, you're going to be fine. If you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s and haven't started saving or saved that much, you're going to have to save a little more, maybe a lot more if you're at the older end of that spectrum, right? So this advice is kind of rule of thumb generic advice. And it feels impossible to say that number because, the average amount of savings into a 401k plan, I think, is right now around 8%. So if you're putting in 8% and your employer is matching half of that, you're actually at 12%. So actually, it's not quite as horrible as you might think in your head. So just like take a deep breath. The second thing I talk about in my book that is really relevant here in terms of automating is another behavioral kind of brain thing, which is that it's really, really hard to take money away from yourself today.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually pretty painless to promise yourself that tomorrow, the next time you get a raise, the next time you get a tax refund, the next time you get some kind of windfall, you're going to save at least half of it. And that's actually a very painless promise to make because actually you're not giving away anything right now. And if you think about the way your 401k plan works, saving money you don't have right now is painless. But when you get that raise, and hopefully you will be getting raises, saving half of it is kind of like magic because you don't actually feel the pain of giving up something. You just get a smaller bump than you otherwise would. So if you have big, big, big plans for that raise, then it's going to be a little painful. But if you kind of set this intention now that in the future, half of your raises go into savings, you can actually get your savings rate up in a couple of years to a significantly higher level than it is now. So that's the best way to strategize about this. Don't make it this impossible, huge, painful thing that is so difficult and painful you'll just immediately give up. Do it in small little bites. This is, the marathon thing, right? This is not a sprint. This is a lifelong journey that you're taking with you and your money and your relationship with it. And it's okay to take it in small steps. Once you start taking those steps, and we can talk about paying down debt as well, it does kind of snowball and you have redefined yourself and you are suddenly a saver and an investor. And it is the most empowering feeling in the world. And suddenly it all gets easier.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about paying down debt, for example, I haven't had debt for a very well. I still have a school loan I'm paying off because the interest rate is so low. It has not been my focus, but it also is a pain, and I would love to just see it gone. But I don't have it. I don't carry any credit card debt, any of those things. But I have in the past, and when I did, at first it was like this albatross around my neck, and I didn't want to look at it, and I didn't want to think of it. And then once you get paying things off like that, it becomes as rewarding as shopping. At least, you can make it that way and say like, oh, look at the numbers going down and look how much I'm saving and playing with, I often talk in my membership and here on the podcast about playing with evidence. So like you can use the fact that you're paying down debt as evidence that you're really good with money, as evidence that you're taking good care of yourself, as evidence that you've saved X number of dollars on top of what you've paid down, and use your book and the guidance in your book on how to do that, which I think is really helpful. I wanted to ask you, I was on a date the other night with a gentleman who told me about this book that I then ran home to read called The 100-Year Life.
Mm.
And it came out a while ago, but it's a great book. I highly recommend it. And it's about the idea that we are likely, especially our children, kids that are born today, they're going to live to be 100. And that changes things, at least for some of us, right? It changes when we retire. It changes how much money you'll need to have for retirement if you decide to retire at 65. But if people used to retire at 65 because they plan to live to 72 and now we're planning to live to 100, does that mean that we're going to be retiring at 90 and we need to take care of our health? And there's a lot of other questions about that. But I read it right after I read your book. So it had me thinking about, in your book, you say every dollar that you save in your 20s is $10 in your 50s. And then it had me thinking, well, if we decide to work later, does that mean that every dollar that we save in our 50s, if we continue to work, is $10 in our 80s? Can you make that correlation that
Yeah,
way?
that's just math, right? If you earn a 7% return on your investments, your money doubles every 10 years. So it's that, that fable about the guy who's rewarded by some Chinese emperor and he asks for a grain of rice and a square checkerboard and he wants it to double on every square. And the guy goes, "Oh, that's ridiculous." And then it's like, how many tons of rice at the end. That geometric progression, right, of your compound returns doubling every 10 years. So if you have $100 in 10 years, it's $200. In 20 years, it's $400. In 30 years, it's $800, right? I mean, you can see how this just goes insanely powerfully.
Yeah.
And sometimes the market does a lot better. And in fact, the historical average is significantly higher than 7%. It's closer to 10%, which means your money is doubling every 7 years, right? So,
Mhm.
so it's really, really powerful. And that's just math, right? So whether it's 30 years is 30 years of returns building up, whether you use 7%, which is what I use because I'm just a little more cautious, or 10%, which you can defend historically, but I think that's aggressive because if it's not that good, then you'll be sorry.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
that's how the math works. I think one of the things that I read that book too, and when it came out, so I'm a little fuzzier on it, but I think that one of the other things that that book talked about, and if not there, then sort of these conversations around what it means to be living these long lives is something that I think I do see Gen Zers and millennials being much more willing to do, which is to think about their career more episodically and be willing to take small breaks from it, which if you're going to work for 60 years, like you need to do that.
Yes.
Um, Something else that I think in the word retirement, right? You will notice it never appears in the title of the book.
Yes.
It's a terrible word. I mean, it literally means to pull yourself away from the world. And I
Yeah.
think certainly if we're leading longer and healthier lives, which not everybody is, but many of us are, it it does beg the question, right? What is our relationship to work? What are we putting into it and what are we getting out of it? Whether it's relationships with people or the feeling that we're doing something worthwhile or contributing to a thing that we believe in. And certainly when I think about what I'm doing now, I am still earning money. I did not earn, or I should rephrase that. I did not save enough, partly because of all the things I talk about in the book, um, to maintain my lifestyle in my, I was 55 when I stopped working and in formal employment.
Mm-hmm.
My husband and I, with what we had saved, we could certainly survive on that kind of money. We would not be living the life we want to lead on that money at all. So, okay, I want to earn money. I'm on some corporate boards. I've written this book. I'm going to be doing public speaking, right? Those are all ways to generate income, but it's partly a money thing. And it's partly like, I'm not going to sit around and read novels for 45 years. Like that doesn't sound like fun. I mean, I love to read novels and I love to sit around and do it. And I'm doing more of it now than I did, 10 years ago, but that's not the point, right? So to me, it's about understanding and redefining the relationship we want to have with the outer world and where we want to be engaged in providing something that will create income. And as I think we move into our mid and late stage careers, and I would say I still have a career, it's just not as an executive at JP Morgan. Um, how much control do we want to have over our time?
Mm.
How much control do we want to have over the specific things that we do? Do we want to have the ability to say yes or no, or is it just going to happen because that's where you work and that's what they tell you to do? Um, do we enjoy what we're doing? Do we have time to give back? Is what we're doing for money allowing us to give back, which I hope this book is, right? So to me, it opens up a different way of thinking about careers and engagement in the workforce. And I certainly think that people in their 20s and 30s have already been doing that, which is making some of us older manager types, 10 years ago, there was a lot of grumbling about, these millennial snowflakes and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh, actually, they were onto something. Wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
that is a more intelligent way of approaching things than what we were trained to do, which is, work your butt off and suck it up, right? Which I don't think is very healthy, frankly.
Totally. I couldn't agree with everything that you just said more. I think that, I have started a brand new career. And I think we have similar paths, though different, but we were both in very high pressure, very demanding, very time demanding careers. And now we have chosen careers that where we have a little bit more control, where we feel like we have a little bit more passion, maybe. And this might be the last one, but we also might choose something else. And
Yeah.
that to me makes your book even more applicable to everyone listening because it's not just about saving for retirement, it's saving for that transition so
Yes.
that you can make that transition in a way like, had I not saved money and I actually did both at the same time and really was conscious and deliberate about it, I would not have been able to do it. And so it's saving. I don't like the word retirement either. And I have a lens that I see people who don't retire, never retired, and worked until the day they died, living longer, living sharper, living happier. And so I definitely see that as aspirational, and that's what I want. And so it's a reason to take care of my health and a reason to take care of my financial health.
I think they
Good.
go hand in hand. And you just said something incredibly important, which is that, the things that we don't use atrophy, and staying engaged, let's use that word instead of working in your career. Because, am I employed? No, I'm self-employed, but I'm doing things. Keeps our minds active, it keeps our relationships active, and it keeps our bodies to some extent active. Because let me tell you, sitting around reading novels does not use a lot of energy up. So,
No. Well, and you keep yourself plenty active with all of your walking and
yes.
the book gives us a lot of insight into Anne, which is also lovely. I'm just so excited as your friend. I'm so excited to see where this book brings you, where it brings the reader, all of the benefit that you are providing, especially for young readers, but for all of us, it's just super exciting. We're almost out of time, and I always end with the same three questions. And this question is like a huge question, so we don't have to dive deep into it, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. What do you think of the idea that money is power? Does that make you want to embrace that idea? Do you bristle against that idea? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I think it is, and to get back to the women and men conversation at the beginning, I think that a lot of women don't like the word power or powerful. I years ago interviewed someone on the podcast, Elizabeth Lesser, who wrote the book Cassandra Speaks, and she works with a lot of women. And she said that the women that she has worked with then, and this was some years ago, pushed back against the word powerful. And I have this germ of an idea that it's because it has something to do with money. And I would just love your insight on it before I let you go.
My first reaction to that money is power was, well, how are you defining power? And, in its most icky way, I suppose, it's power over people and the ability to make them do things, which I reject as a framing. Um, I would reframe it as freedom, and, maybe the freedom not to give an F about anything, right? And if I frame it like that and say power is the ability to do what I want, to be myself, and to not have to self-censor what I do or say. I don't know that I had to self-censor myself as much as I realize I was in my career. I suspect I didn't. I did it to myself.
Yes.
But certainly, there's certainly some things that my former employer would not have been happy to have me say. Or the ways I might say them are certainly maybe a little less politically sensitive than I might now. But if I define money as freedom, I think that is true. And I don't know that I'd agree that the reason women don't like the concept of power is because it's related to money. I would turn it around and say my sense is, and I'm no expert, but just observing myself who had a powerful job and was a powerful person, I never felt it.
Yeah.
And I certainly feel like I was trained and by society, by everything around me to be wary of exercising that power because, and I also grew up in a very Japanese American culture where the nail that sticks up is pounded down.
Mm.
So I was, for my own reasons, very wary of standing out because it was culturally not acceptable in where I grew up. Just like it just wasn't.
Yeah.
Um, and my parents were good Midwesterners, and sort of good Midwesterners don't do that either. So, I mean, it's like that's how I read it, but I think there's definitely, what's the chicken and what the egg is there. I don't know, but they're definitely connected.
I mean, it's a whole other conversation. I may have you back one day when you're not promoting the book, because I think the self-censoring I did as well, the thinking that we're not as powerful as we are. It's very similar to your survey that women don't think they're doing as well with money as they are.
Uh,
And I just want to say the authors of the book, The Power Code, it's Claire Shipman and Katie Kay. They wrote The Confidence Code, and they recently came out with a book, The Power Code, and they would be so thrilled with your answer because they talk about that the old paradigm of power, which is the male paradigm, is power over, and the women tend to talk about it in terms of power to.
mm,
And it's exactly what you just said. And I do think money's related to both, right? You have
yeah.
power over people and you have power to. So I love that. And I just had to get your answer, and I had to get it for the listeners and not just you and I chatting over coffee. I know you have back to backs with this book. The book comes out, it will come out right around the time that this podcast comes out. So that's good
Awesome.
news. Before I let you go, we always end with the same three questions. And the first question is a new one for me. And it is, what is the last thing that you advocated for?
Well, I guess this conversation is an example of what I'm advocating for right now, which is my book. But I guess beyond that, I've spent the last, couple of months really advocating for ways to improve the 401k system and sort of beyond my book and myself, which is it still feels a little awkward and funny to me, and it's part of what I'm learning to lean into, not to redefine, not promoting myself, but promoting the importance of my idea.
Yes.
And that is much more comfortable for me and
Yeah.
and makes it feel not icky. But it's really, if I think about all the other stuff I'm spending my time doing while I'm also doing this book thing, is really helping figure out ways to reduce cost, ways to improve returns, ways to improve access for people saving for retirement. So that's what I do.
Amazing. And I will say you're not alone, and there's all kinds of studies that show that women are better at advocating for something external. And
Yeah.
so it's smart to externalize it into like your idea, or, sometimes I'll make it about my nieces instead of me because it allows you to be a stronger advocate. So you are not alone. What book would you recommend to the listeners other than your own, which of course we're going to put the link to in the show notes, as well as the link to your website. But what other book would you recommend?
I it's this is an old book. It came out, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, but it was one of the books that was the first book that helped me. And I think I read it probably right around the time I was developing the retirement products. And I talk about, this in the book, learning about how our brain works and like unlocking my own, like, oh, this is not my fault. I'm not stupid or lazy or, just irresponsible. This is the way I'm made. All right, let me get over this stuff. But there's this great money book called Money Doesn't Grow on Trees. And I can't remember the author's name right now.
We'll
It's you
find
can
it. I'll
you
find
can
it.
still get it. And it, especially if are there any parents listening, it's what we did with our kids. And it really helped them understand back to the power of money and its ability to control us rather than us controlling it. And it was basically a path towards giving kids budgets and letting them make decisions and giving them total control of the money that you give them. And we had allowances and they mowed the lawn and it was all that. But really it's their money and you tell them what your expectations are for it and then you get out of the way.
Yeah.
And that's something I realized in hindsight I never got growing up. And that was part of my problem, right?
Mm, yeah. Okay, last question is my favorite question. Your answer to this question will be added to the Elegant Warrior Spotify playlist. What is your theme song, Anne? What song would you be playing if you walked onto the stage of life today?
Well, that is hysterical because I'm giving a keynote speech at a conference, a big conference in 2 weeks, and I had to come up with walk-on music, and I just froze. I was like, I don't know. And I asked my future daughter-in-law this question, who has been a huge, she's thought of the book title. Thank you, Molly. So she's responsible for the book title and my walk-on music, which is Barbie Dreams from the movie.
I love it.
And it's I don't know, it just makes me happy listening to the song. I feel happy and peppy, and it is about dreams and achieving them. And I was like, yeah, that's what saving for retirement is all about.
Yeah. The book is phenomenal. Everyone who's listening could benefit from reading it and will enjoy reading it, which is not always the case that I would say for me personally when I'm reading a book about finances and Roth IRAs. So you did an amazing job, and it's really wonderful to have you here talking about it, Anne.
Oh, thank you so much, Heather. I really enjoyed this conversation.